Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 2, Fledgling, Chapters 1 and 2. Let's begin. You can't keep doing this, Mirai said tiredly. Doing what? Toshinori asked, though he knew exactly what his sidekick was referring to. Mirai glared at him, his yellow eyes were particularly piercing. Yes, you saved them, he jumped ahead in the conversation. But then you spent over an hour coughing up blood. Chio had to come and heal you. So what was I meant to do, just leave them to die? I couldn't do that. The number one hero countered fiercely. You could have called in backup. You could have distracted them. You didn't have to rush in and fight them. You still haven't fully recovered. Mirai growled. You could have called me. He added. He would have thought of something. No, Toshinori rejected that course of action. He shook his head. No, I could not have left them. They need a pillar, he stated softly. Sasaki huffed and then rose. Toshinori watched as his sidekick came close and then slapped his arm. It was a shock when the next thing he saw was glowing purple eyes. His sidekick twitched and All Might expected him to come out of the vision quickly. He didn't though. He kept twitching, and from the length of time Mirai was remaining in his quirk, Toshinori knew he was looking at as much of his future as he could. It didn't matter. He knew he was injured. He knew he was on borrowed time now, and that just meant he had to step up his work. He had to be there for people. And he had to find a successor. Just because All for One was gone, didn't mean that One for All had to die. He had time yet. He could search for the perfect successor, and while he was doing that, he would still carry on his work. Mirai twitched again. The purple rings and patterns in his eyes expanded and contracted as he searched through the future. Toshinori waited. It would be nice if Mirai could see his successor, but he doubted the man would tell him even if he did. He twitched again. He really was looking into as much of the future as he could. All Might knew what every twitch meant. It meant that Mirai was shifting his focus, searching through years, or events stretching into the future. All Might got up and gently pushed Mirai down into the chair he was sitting in. While his quirk was active, his sidekick was conscious, but when he got involved in his vision, it was as if he was in a trace. As such, he could be moved. It looked like Mirai was going to use the full hour of his quirk, so after settling him more comfortably, he noted the time and picked up his laptop. He had paperwork to do, and just before Mirai came out of his vision, he'd make some tea. Izuku gasped for air as he slid down the wall onto the bench that was against it. He was training with Kurogiri with the new quirks that his dad had given him. It was going well, but he was exhausted. He had no idea Kurogiri was this fit. And the man had any number of good suggestions on how Izuku could combine his quirks. The Misty Man had simply laughed off his compliments, indicating that he'd spoken to his dad about possibilities. Izuku pulled out his phone as he tried to take deep breaths. It felt good to be doing something, even if that something was just exercising. The motion took his mind off events. But there was something he'd been meaning to do today before he began training. Kurogiri had gotten him down to the training room before he had. Knock, knock, he sent the message with a grin. Hopefully Himiko would be awake. Who's there? Izuku grinned. She was awake. Ivana, he sent back. It wasn't the best joke, but it was the thought that counted. Ivana who? Ivana suck your blood, Izuku replied. He snorted softly at her response. At least she liked the joke, but before he could reply, he saw that Himiko was typing again. It's not fair that All Might is back, when your dad is still injured. Izuku's eyes widened at the statement. Hitoshi understood and Ochoko didn't quite get it. Himiko knew society wasn't good, but he hadn't realized exactly how much she'd felt his pain. It's not, he typed back, but there is nothing that can be done about it for the moment. He was beginning to understand more now of why his dad said society needed to change, and why his dad would need his and Tomura's help to do it. It's still not fair, she insisted. Izuku felt warm at that. He smiled gently at his phone, but before he could form a reply, Kurogiri returned, his yellow eyes expectant. Gotta go, he sent to Himiko. More training to be done. Practice hard. Her response was almost immediate, allowing Izuku to see it before he put his phone down again and got up. After a quick drink, he was ready to go again. Mirai came back to himself with a gasp as his quirk deactivated. It wasn't often that he used the entire hour to see the future. Mostly he just needed a hint about something specific. The smell of tea reached his nose. He recognized the scent. It was one of the ones he had for restoration. He felt a burst of thanks towards the man who had to have put it there. And then he recognized that he was sitting. Another burst of thanks. Sir Night-Eye blinked, moistening his eyes as he shifted to pick up the tea. The movement brought the attention of All Might, who looked over at him. "You're back," he murmured, closing his laptop screen. "I am," Mirai replied, trying to get his thoughts under control. He'd seen so much. It was always difficult when he looked that long into the future, both in time of quirk activation and in years. "Drink up," Toshinori said. Despite the fact they had been discussing his fitness to work an hour ago. And that Mirai didn't agree with his course of action, the number one hero was still caring. That was the reason he was number one, Sasaki's mind reminded him, even as he took up the tea and sipped at it. It wasn't cold, which meant that All Might had made it fresh, already knowing that Sir Night-Eye was going to use the entire hour his quirk afforded him. The warmth spread through him, but that was superficial. The herbs worked to calm him, but Mirai could still feel his heart racing at what he had seen. He sipped the tea slowly, trying to order his thoughts, and for one of the few times in his life, he wanted to use his quirk again. Not on Toshinori. There'd been a spectator in All Might's life. He hadn't noticed him at first. All Might's battles always had spectators, but eventually Sir Night-Eye had picked him out despite the changes of hair and eye color. There was something in that child's eyes that stood out from the crowd. But he hadn't been present at Toshinori's death, so perhaps he was just a particularly enthusiastic fanboy. "So, what happens?" All Might asked. "You die," slipped out before Mirai could decide what to lead with. Yagi gave him a look. It was amused. "Everyone dies," he said sagely. "Not like that. Not as," he wasn't sure what to call what he'd seen. It felt like it was the opening move to something, but what he had no idea, and with his quirk, until he knew who else might be involved, and who survived that event, he would not be able to see what All Might's death was the starting point for. "No," Mirai shook his head. No. You don't die peacefully. He didn't want to say. It was brutal. "So who kills me?" There was a kind of morbid curiosity with the question. Mirai's mind pulled up the memory of the events. It was toned in that way. All the memories that came from his quirk were. There was the impression of teeth. They weren't human teeth, or at least, not normal human teeth. They were pointed and sharp, and by the time All Might died, they were stained with blood. They were attached to a huge creature. "I don't know," Mirai replied. "I've never seen." He paused. He wasn't sure if the creature was a transformed human or something else. Them? Before. I didn't recognize them as human, but they could be transformed. "Everyone dies," All Might repeated. "Not like that," Mirai insisted. Toshinori gave him a look but then nodded. There was no point in arguing again. "What else did you see?" he asked instead. At the question, Sir Night-Eye took a deep breath, pushing All Might's death from his mind temporarily. He also pushed aside the knowledge that everything he'd ever seen had come true. "You were going to get a fan," he chuckled. "What about a successor?" "I wasn't focused on that, but there were several people who could be," Sir Night-Eye said. "Really?" All Might seemed happy about that fact. He ran his mind back over what he'd seen. There weren't that many teenagers in the mix, though they became more prolific near the end of Toshinori's life. In his mind's eye, he saw a progression of faces, but Mirai didn't recognize any of them. Still, he knew that was a few years in the future, so that wasn't surprising. "You were interacting with people of the appropriate age group," he confirmed. Yagi nodded slowly, still pleased at that, before his expression clouded. "Did you see any evidence of him?" "He's dead," Mirai objected. "And the body was in some lab being cut up for experiments. Hardly the most dignified end." "Did you see any evidence of him?" Toshinori repeated, his voice chillingly quiet. "You mean his son?" Sir Night-Eye asked. There had been something. Just one battle where. No, it couldn't have been all for one. He was dead. Except. Sir Night-Eye knew his visions. They did not lie, and they did not change. The man Toshinori was fighting had all for one's build, his suit, his quirks, but not his face because that was covered by a black metal helmet. And Mirai didn't know what that meant. He needed time to think about that one, to pull the memory up and examine it all. All Might just gave him a look. Mirai knew better than to say anything about it. It appeared the number one hero still believed it was his fault that Tsukauchi's mission had failed. He didn't reply but instead closed his eyes and looked through the memories his quirk had given him. The number one hero knew how his quirk worked, so knew it would take him some time to go through the memory. Sir Night-Eye possessed a good memory, but part of his training had been to sharpen it so that he could recall and focus on the visions his quirk showed him and extract details others would miss. The child had green hair and eyes. There was no one who stood out in his visions with those features. The little fan's hair color changed frequently and his eyes were a molten gold, which looked remarkably like All for One's eyes. He brought up the memories. The child wasn't really a child. Instead, he was a teen and slowly got older each fight, but he never did anything more than just watch on the sidelines. If he was All for One's child, surely he would have done something more? I'm not sure, Mirai said at length. There's no one obvious. At that, All Might nodded. The number one hero drew the same conclusions he had, that if All for One's son was going to be involved as a villain then he'd be obvious about it. All right, Toshinori said, leaning forward. Let's deal with what obviously bothered you. How do I die? Mirai looked down for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He didn't need to look at the memories to know how it happened. You keep working. You keep going with One for All. Even with your body damaged. The damage never gets a chance to heal and keeps deteriorating. Your time as All Might gets shorter and shorter, and at some point, I'm assuming that you find a successor. But then you don't retire. Or at least it doesn't seem as if you did, Sir Night-Eye made the correction. With his quirk, he could look into the future of an individual for 1 hour after activation. He saw things in real time, which meant he had to focus on what was important. He'd flicked between a lot of scenes in Toshinori's life, getting a general gist for how things had worked out, all the way until the end. That he had seen in full. Just the last part though. He hadn't seen the entire battle, but he'd looked around the location as much as he could and it had been empty. The creature was all that was there. Which meant it was most likely a transformed human. A villain. And then? All Might prompted. Someone took you out. I don't recognize them, but it appears to be a mutant type or a transformation type quirk. A full transformation, Sir Night-Eye emphasized. Even with quirks becoming more powerful, complete transformation ones were rare. Everyone dies, Toshinori repeated. You didn't have to, Mirai returned immediately. Yagi gave him a questioning look. He knew how foresight worked. He knew that Mirai couldn't have seen everything. You didn't have to, Mirai repeated. But I will, the number one hero said. You've always insisted that you can't change your visions, so should I not do everything I can until that point? The question was damnably astute. He'd never been able to change the events he saw. Mirai trembled. That was the problem. He wanted to change this vision. All Might gave him a smile. It was not the smile he gave the masses. This was softer, and more personal. It's all right, he said gently. I'll tell you something I learned in the instant he swung at me and I was swinging at him. I didn't know if I was going to survive, but I realized then that death is a part of life. Death is not defeat. Mirai, death just is. If you accept it then there is nothing to be afraid of, not like he was. But you don't have to die. If you find a successor and then retire, you won't be in that fight. Yagi didn't say anything to that, but Mirai heard the words anyway. He didn't know that. Not for sure, because in the hour of his vision he couldn't see everything. Mentally, Sir Night-Eye shook his head. Toshinori Yagi, All Might have accepted his death, he hadn't. He'd find a way to change his vision. Just this once, he'd find a way. Izuku looked over at his dad. It was nice to see him out of the treatment room, but he couldn't help the way his gaze went to the tubes that were still inserted into him. There was one going into his cheek, just under the scar tissue, and another 2 into his neck. Izuku really hoped they weren't going into his dad's blood vessels, but he had a strange feeling that they were. It made him feel sick. A thick but flexible tube went straight into his trachea. There was the hiss of air all the time. His dad smiled at him. Izuku resisted the urge to cry. How was the last day of school, my little dragon? He asked. Izuku looked to the side. He didn't want to talk about it. She still hasn't come around, his father said. That caused Izuku to stare at him with wide eyes. How did you know? He asked. He hadn't said anything. A father has his ways, All for One replied. But you always know. Izuku objected. You told me, my little dragon. Without saying a word. The green-haired boy frowned. How did I tell you? When you looked away, Hisashi explained. Now come here, and let me see if I can guess your hair color, he encouraged his son. He knew Izuku didn't like his current appearance, but for the moment, there was nothing he could do about it. The various tubes were necessary. Izuku came closer, allowing All for One to rest his large hand on his son's head. It was a calming ritual for them both. He felt Izuku's curls, letting the individual strands of hair run through his fingertips. With his senses of sight and smell being destroyed, he had found his sense of touch was greatly amplified. Oh my, Hisashi murmured after a moment. I do believe it is your natural color. Yep. That's good. You must never be afraid to be yourself, he told his son. I know, Dad, you said that already. Did I? Hisashi whispered. How wise of me. They sat for a few moments, just enjoying each other's company. For anyone looking at All for One, they would be amazed that he could be so calm and relaxed. They would be gobsmacked that he was with a child, but beyond that they would be amazed that it seemed like he was doing nothing. The Emperor of the Underworld seldom did nothing. You have to be patient, All for One said eventually, keeping his voice soft so as not to disturb his son. Patient? Izuku asked. With your friend, Ochoko, he explained. She understands what you are saying and she sees the truth from the examples you give her. She sees your pain. But then when she's away from you, the facade comes back in and the world presents itself to her as the heroes want you to believe it appears. He felt Izuku frown. What does facade mean? It means mask, he replied. Or a disguise. It means that the world appears as one thing, when it's really something else. Hisashi gave all the explanations. For all that his son was intelligent, he forgot that he didn't know everything he did. That was okay, it was his duty to teach his son. Izuku nodded his understanding. It is a difficult thing, my little dragon, for someone to give up all that they have known, and I cannot say if she will be able to. You mean she won't believe me? Oh no, your friend believes you, but against the weight of the world and her own desire not to be hurt, it may not be enough and you will drift apart. No. I want to be her friend, Izuku objected. Then, my little dragon, at some point you are going to have to decide if your difference of opinion on society is going to be enough to drive you apart. It doesn't have to be soon. It may not be for years, but eventually, if she does not come around, you will have to make that decision. All for One could feel Izuku tremble under his hand, but his son knew he spoke the truth. He knew better than to complain. You have time to wait, he reassured Izuku. His son wouldn't start working on his behalf for years yet. Unlike the heroes, he didn't use children. They lapsed into silence again. Even with his experience, All for One wasn't sure how things would work out with Ochoko. Every outcome would be a lesson for Izuku, and in every outcome his son would know he was supported. He just had to wait. Did you have a good party? Kurogiri asked Izuku. The boy smiled up at him. It was cheerful. Yep, came the very happy reply. The Warp Gate privately thought that Izuku might be happier about visiting his dad now, but he said nothing about that. That is good. I'm sad that Himiko couldn't come though, the boy added. It is a long way from Niigata to here. The Misty Man pointed out reasonably. I know, Izuku agreed. He had been hoping all his friends could come to his party, but Himiko's parents had said no. They didn't want their daughter traveling so far. It was about 8 hours on a train, and while Izuku, or rather his dad, had assured them that Himiko would not actually travel on a train but would be traveling via Kurogiri's warp quirk, they still said no. She'd complained via messages to him, and they had spent some time on the phone earlier at the party, so at least Hitoshi and Ochoko had gotten to speak to her. It wasn't the same. Now he was going to spend time with his father. He wasn't sure what they were going to do. They couldn't go out and look for villain fights, and with his dad focusing on recovery, Izuku didn't think he'd have been able to organize anything else. It didn't matter though. Just spending time with his dad was going to be enough. But his dad had hinted that he had something good, and Izuku went through the warp gate Kurogiri made without looking back. He was a bit surprised when he came out into an office. His dad's office had been destroyed. This one was different though. It was smaller, more personal. My little dragon. His dad greeted him, indicating that he should come close. Izuku raced over and gave his dad a hug. Happy birthday, Izuku, Hisashi said. You're 10 now. Such a big boy. He sensed Izuku grin at him and felt a stab of anger at All Might, which was quickly shoved aside. His son didn't deserve to feel his anger. Izuku laughed. It was a nice sound. I've got an unusual present for you this year. My little dragon, All for One said. Actually, I've got two presents. Izuku knew better than to squeal, but he could feel his son quiver in happiness. One present you are going to have to wait until next weekend, he told Izuku. Is it a quirk? Hisashi chuckled. It is a quirk. What does it do? Izuku immediately demanded. It's a secret. But you will be getting it off the current owner. At that, Izuku blinked. All for One could tell in the way Izuku moved that he was confused. He sighed. It's a little bit of a misnomer to call it a present, he said finally. But you know I help people with their quirks, my little dragon. I cannot really do that now. But you can, for me. At that, Izuku gasped. It was a happy gasp though. All for One could imagine what it was about. While Izuku knew what society was like, he still thought it worthwhile to help people. Giran had finally found someone willing to sell their quirk, and while the price was slightly higher than he wanted. It was for his son. So next week, you will help them in my place. That's why it's got to wait a week. I have to find out the details, he explained. You mean it? I mean it, All for One confirmed. Izuku hugged him harder, activating the strength enhancement quirk he'd been given a little bit. It was a good thing he was robust. The second present is for now, but is a bit different. What is it? Izuku asked. He was still easily distracted. At the question, All for One sighed softly. I know you don't want to replace me, Izuku. No. His son almost growled, remembering their previous conversation. But I want you to be skilled in business, as I am, he continued, ignoring Izuku's distress. If his son listened, he would learn there was nothing to fear. That way you can replace me as the manager of my businesses, he finished. That seemed to get through to Izuku. He felt his son jerk as he said the last words. Manager? Izuku asked. I've been working, my little dragon. But I can't do as much as I used to, All for One explained gently. As such, when you come of age, I want you to be able to step into some of my roles. In that way, you will replace me, and there's nothing bad about that. But I don't. I can't. My little dragon, it won't be for years yet. I have appointed people to run the companies, until you can. They are doing that now, so I don't have to work as much. But I would like you to take over. In another 10 years or so, he tacked on to the end. He felt Izuku relax at that. For now though, I want to begin teaching you about those companies. How is that a birthday present? Izuku asked, confused. All for One laughed. Because I'm going to give you 2 lots of birthday money today. And we are going to invest one together, and the other you are going to invest by yourself. Then in 5, 7 and 10 years' time we are going to look at the 2 investments to see what has done best. Oh, Izuku said softly. He knew about birthday money. Most of his friends wanted it for theirs. He never really needed it because he had everything he wanted, and if he needed something, Kurogiri got it. So he hadn't really needed money that much. Plus, he had some for when he wanted to buy something, so it wasn't a big deal. I will teach you how to invest, so that you can do it for yourself, All for One continued. And it doesn't matter what you invest in. You can invest it in research, a company or anything you want. While we will compare, it's not a competition, and I remember my first investments. He snorted. Some of them had been spectacularly bad. He hadn't known anything then, but he'd learned, just as Izuku would learn. Were they bad? Izuku asked, his amusement evident. I didn't have anyone teaching me, Hisashi told his son before he sighed. They were very bad, he admitted. Izuku laughed, and All for One found that he didn't mind admitting to those past failures if this was his reward. Now, I'm going to give you 2 lots of 500,000 yen to invest, Hisashi said, ignoring the way Izuku's gasp. This time was one of surprise. He supposed it was a fair bit of money for a 10-year-old, but he wanted Izuku to be able to make realistic investments, and this was the minimum he could bring himself to trade with, even for teaching. Do you want to get started? As expected, that got Izuku back on track, and his son nodded. All right, then this is how we begin. Inko. The call caused her to jerk. She took a few panted breaths. Maigo, Inko said the name of her colleague. Inko, the woman said more softly this time. What's the matter? You've been staring at that page for the last 10 minutes. She took another breath. I'm sorry. It's okay, Maigo reassured her. But there's something wrong. You can tell us. Inko nodded. She knew she could tell them. They understood. It's Izuku's birthday today, she managed to get out before she choked. Instantly, a look of understanding came to Mago's features. Inko didn't see it because tears filled her eyes. Her other co-workers, Setsu and Yume, also understood, and Inko didn't hear when Yume got up and bustled off to the kitchen. He's been gone longer than I have had him, and she couldn't complete the sentence. Mago embraced her. It's okay to cry, she told Inko. It happened to them all on occasion. Yume had cried on her wedding anniversary and Setsu on the anniversary of the day her brother had been declared legally dead. Inko sniffed. She gasped for air. I just want him back. Yume came back with tea. She put the hot cup in front of Inko. Drink it. She didn't take the cup. Instead, Inko pulled a handkerchief from one of her pockets. The small pieces of fabric had become her constant companions over the years. She wiped her eyes and blew her nose before taking the tea. It was bland stuff. Their work didn't provide anything robust, but she needed the warm drink. She took a deep breath, feeling the liquid settle in her stomach. I just want him back, Inko repeated softly. Without tears. And I just can't believe that this helps, she added, gesturing towards the document she hadn't been reading. It helps, Setsu said immediately, not focusing on her loss. But Inko didn't complete the sentence. They never found anyone. Even if we don't find people, Yume said gently, our findings close off avenues of investigation, and that is valuable. I know it doesn't seem that way, but for every avenue we close, it means that we are one closer to the truth. And that truth may not always be nice, but at least it gives closure. Inko took another sip of tea before she nodded. She wanted Izuku back, but if she couldn't have that, she at least wanted to know what had happened. Even if he was dead. Then at least the wound in her heart could. It wouldn't heal, but it wouldn't weep for the unknown. It would have closure. That's really what she wanted, what she needed. She nodded at the ladies surrounding her. All right, then let's close off another couple of branches of investigation. Inko said, giving a wan smile. The others smiled and nodded and didn't push for anything further. They all had their own pain. End The Emperor's Dragon, Fledgling, Chapters 1 and 2. Author note: 500,000 yen is about $5,000 American dollars in today's current exchange rate, which, for the amount of money All for One has to be pulling in from illegal activities, can't be that much, but to a 10-year-old is a huge amount of money. Would anyone like to guess which investment does better? The one Izuku does by himself? Or the one that All for One teaches his son with? Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.